I think we'll get started because it's late and the sessions are running a little bit over because we all talk so much. We have so much to say after all those years of silence. I'm Linda Brown. As some of you know, I'm a birth mother who relinquished a child to adoption in 1962, and I'm also the mother of two sons whom I had after that adoption of my original daughter. And in 1975 or 6, I had sent a letter back to the agency when our daughter would have been about 13 years old to ask them to please put the letter into the file so that if she or her adoptive family ever returned, that there would be some updated information for her. I was one of the birth mothers who was terrified of making any request to the agency or any place else. I was really hidden, I was really in the closet, in spite of the fact that I married the father of my child and both families knew about this adoption. It was never spoken about until Karen came back 21 years later. No one mentioned it. My husband and I, her father, occasionally had conversations about her, usually, as most of you may know, on her birthday, on Mother's Day, holidays, and sometimes in between when I looked at my other children who I was raising and realized that she must resemble them. So that although my husband and I talked about her, there was so much pain and so much guilt and so much concern we each had for the other of causing more hurt to each other that we really avoided talking about it. And then in 1984, Karen went to the agency that August. She was 21 years old, which, as some of you may have experienced, was exactly the age that I was when I relinquished her. And we got very lucky. The social worker at the agency in New Jersey told Karen that there was information and that she would share it with her if she wanted. And she read the letter to Karen. And then she asked Karen if Karen would like the social worker to call us. And Karen said, yes, she did. And the social worker said, would you like to think about that for a little while? And Karen said, no, I just want you to call them. And so that I got one of those terrible, out-of-the-blue phone calls that everyone warns birth mothers about and warns adoptees about and so forth. It wasn't the proverbial knock on the door, but it was a phone call one Thursday morning at about 10 o'clock, September 6th, 1984. And actually, I have special reason for remembering that date because September 6th is her father's birthday. So that we got that call on his birthday. And, and so, naturally, I was doing what many birth mothers, but not all do. I was jumping up and down with great joy, shouting, yelling, dancing around the house like a real idiot. And then started crying right away because underneath that relief and that joy was all of the 21 years of pain and suffering. So that's how Karen and I were reunited. And I had never thought, like so many of us, that there was another birth mother out there. I literally never thought about it, so I didn't realize that there had to be other birth mothers out there. And I didn't know the phrase birth mother. And in fact, just to digress for a minute, I'm a little concerned about the phrase. I mean, I worry about that, and I'm beginning to think I'm going to just call myself a mother of 3 children, one of whom I relinquished to adoption, because I worry about labels and how they can get distorted, and we can talk about birth mothers as though they just give birth, and about making adoption plans as though we're making financial plans, which today it seems many people are doing. So that, anyway, that's how we were reunited. And as I began to deal with and struggle with some of the downside of a reunion, I realized I needed to get some help and talk to somebody. So I found out about CUB and didn't live near a CUB, a Concerned United Birth Parents group, but found Joyce Pavo's name on a list of people who knew something about how to talk to people involved in adoption. And Joyce Pavo, as some of you know, is a counselor, is an adoptee, and does some very good pre- and post-adoption consulting work out of Cambridge, Mass. And so I had a meeting with Joyce, a session with Joyce, and talked about being a birth mother, talked about reunion, but mostly talked about why am I having such confusing feelings about my daughter? Why am I having such confusing feelings about my mother, who is still living? How can I deal with all of the mixed feelings that I'm having? And one day I'd wake up and I would love my daughter, and my thought would be, I don't care who cares about this or who gets upset about this in my family, I'm going to introduce her to everyone, and that's their tough luck. And the next day I would wake up and think, I can't introduce her to people in the family. What about their feelings? You know, they have rights too. So that, and then some days when we first met each other, I would find I loved her and thought she was wonderful and perfect and all of that. And the next day I'd be looking at her and thinking, that reminds me of something I would do, which I don't like about myself, or that reminds me of something, you know, my mother would do that I don't like. And so there were all these very confusing feelings coming along very fast. We also began at that same time to tell our friends about Karen and about the story of the adoption. And one of the friends I told was a woman I had known for about 20 years. We had each ended up marrying college roommates and got to know each other that way. And she also happened to be a researcher and a feminist, and someone who for many years had wanted to do some writing on a humanistic subject because she had ended up through one path or another working in marketing research with her husband, but very much was pulled toward the psychology of women, towards women's issues, and had had some writing experience. And when I told her this story, and we started talking about what happens to birth mothers and what happens to adoptees, and what about the adoptive families, and how was Karen's adoptive family reacting, Judy and I both realized that there was a gap out there for those of us once the search was over, that then there was this enormous gap of literature to sort of read and go to and at least try to find something that might be useful. And Judy asked me if I would like to work on a book about post-reunion and what happens to some of us and what some of the issues are. And I was very eager to do that because probably many birth mothers and adoptees want to write books and do plays and tell the story. Because, you know, of course it seems to us, and I think it's true, that it is one of the most primitive and profound experiences that human beings have, birth. And it's one of the closest, it is the closest physiological and in some ways emotional connection that you ever have with anyone else. So that we're not just talking about an adoption plan made in a lawyer's office, we're talking about a primitive fact of life. So we realized that this was a major topic, that there had to be millions of birth parents out there, and millions of birth fathers out there, and all of the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents, the cousins, the nieces and the nephews of all of us. And we could not know each other in this country according to the laws of this country and according to the prejudice against, I believe, against women who give away their children. The only time we are not held up as people to be scorned is when people want to get our babies from us. And I get calls, not every day and not every month, but frequently enough from young birth mothers today who have had their babies coerced away from them in ways that are so subtle that to me it makes it even worse than the kinds of things I was told by the social worker, which just blatantly trying to get my baby and telling me that I was not going to be a fit mother for my child because I didn't have a wedding ring on. It was absolutely straight out. You know, why would you do that to your child? Why would you keep a child and let your child be called bastard in school? And you know she will or he will be called that. I mean, that was blatant, you know, telling me I was undeserving of being a parent. But what bothers me more, and I think actually borders on evil, is the subtle coercion of the Michael Sullivan's TV ads, which show a loving adoptive couple cradling a baby. They're nicely dressed, they're both nice looking, and a desperate birth mother saying, I didn't know where to go until I found, you know, I live in New England, and he has an organization in Boston called Adoptions of New England, and I've spoken to that group, and they do not do open adoptions. And they coerce these babies away from these mothers, so that worries me a good deal more than in a sense what happened to us, which was absolutely straightforward. So Judy and I decided that there was a gap for those of us who'd had these reunions, and we would try to fill that gap a little bit. And we decided to interview 30 women who had given their children away to adoption. And the way we found them, it's very difficult to do research on people who are hidden away and whose records you can't get to and so forth. So there's not a way yet to do some random sampling, scientifically hard work on looking at what happens to all of us. So what we did was talk to people who ran search and support groups throughout the country and ask them for volunteers. So it's a biased sample. These are women who relinquished children to adoption who wanted to tell what this experience was like for them from 6 months after the reunion up to 10 years after the reunion. That was the range that we had when we got our 30 people who were willing to do this. And half of the interviews were done in person by me, and half were sent to us from different places around the country, taped 2-hour interviews based on the same questionnaire. And what we found was that each time I listened in person and sat through with the birth mothers, and I was not a professional researcher, and with most of them at some point we both cried and sort of reached out and said, this always happens, we always do this, it's okay. But every time I listened to those women and every time I listened to the tapes, there was always a new twist on the topic. You would think that you had heard the worst possible relinquishment story, the worst possible post-reunion experience, and somebody else would say something else. So that there was a lot of pain in these interviews that I was hearing. It certainly raised a lot for me. But I think what we actually ended up finding hopefully will be helpful to some of us going through it now, and hopefully the fact that the 30 we chose because presumably, again, statistically, that's supposed to at least make sure that we got all of the issues to do with this topic covered. It does not mean that that book says everything there is to say about post-reunion, because we selected not to do interviews with reunions that had ended, not to do interviews where one person wanted to be in the reunion but the other didn't. Although I'm the first person to say that I think the search and the reunion itself, whatever it's like, is where the healing begins for birth mothers and for adoptees. And I know that it's hurtful to not be able to continue in a reunion when one of you wants it. But what we wanted to do was to look at what does happen in the reunions that do last. What does happen to those? And what we found was that although there were differences, there were similarities. First of all, we found out that the post-reunion period, which we sort of tentatively defined as the decision time when the two people decide, yes, there is going to be an ongoing relationship. Up till that point, we considered it the reunion event. In other words, the meeting and so forth. What we also found is that you cannot talk about post-reunion without going right back to the surrender. These are not separate events in birth mothers' lives. When we ask people, how is your post-reunion going? Tell us about this, or talk a little bit to us about that. Every single birth mother went right back to the surrender, right back to the pregnancy, right back to the maternity home, right back to wherever they stayed during that time, through the surrender process. You can't separate out these events. They're all connected. So that what we found was that, the first thing we found is that there was no way to prepare yourself, if you're a birth mother, for a reunion and a post-reunion. There was no one else out there, any of us in this generation could turn to and say, well, what was that like for you to have the reunion? What was that like for you a year later when you found out this about your adopted away child's adoptive family life? Or what was anything like? We really, and in support groups is where you find that today. That's where we try to get some of those answers and so forth. But a lot of us didn't join support groups as a way of getting found or of finding. So that's the first thing that they all told us. There was no preparation, and in a sense, there is no preparation for this event because there is no other relationship like this in our lives. When we asked the mothers to try to describe what relationships were closest, what did this remind them of, this new relationship with their newfound son or daughter, we all struggled with that. They all struggled with that, to say that, well, it reminds me a little bit of being a very close friend, but it's not exactly like being a very close friend because he's my son or she's my daughter, and that makes it different. Or, well, it's kind of like being an aunt, but That's not my niece or nephew. That's my son or my daughter. Well, it's a little bit like being a mother to my other children, but it's not, because I have a history with my other children, and this son or daughter is a stranger to me. And so that there really is no exactly comparable way to describe these relationships. It's a struggle to describe what this is like. And I think one of the things that shows us is that it is outside of the normal, expectable events in our lives. That this is not something, we all grew up knowing that there are tragedies that can happen, death, divorce, and so forth. No one knows what this is like except for the people who go through it, and until very recently we've all been silenced by the culture in terms of talking about it. So we're still struggling to describe what is this relationship like with our newly found son or daughter. It took me really, I've known Karen, our daughter, for 6 years. It took me into the 4th year to even think of her as daughter, comfortably think of her as daughter, because I truly felt that she had not been my daughter, and I had not been a mother to her the way I know mothers are mothers to children. So there are all these things that are excruciatingly painful that have no precedence for them. So that the first thing that we found in terms of the reaction in the post-reunion was that post-reunion is like an explosive event for the birth mothers we talked to. It's an explosive event in their lives, and it has reverberating effects. It is not just something that happens and then it's a neat little thing that 6 months later or a year or 2 later or 9 years later you have worked it through in sort of a nice, neat, pat fashion. It doesn't happen like that. There are ups and downs that can come along even 10 years into the relationship, so that it is an explosive event. And we found that there were 3 phases basically that the birth mothers go through. One is the initial sort of honeymoon phase, where most of you feel relief and joy and excitement. And it's like being on a honeymoon, and there's a lot of honeymoon behavior, meeting each other at restaurants and dressing up and so forth, particularly between some mothers and sons, but also with mothers and daughters. How do I look? Should I lose weight? I lost weight, I've gained it all back, for instance. So that, there are all these sort of almost as though you're dating and falling in love. And this was true for the birth mothers in our sample, as well as the of daughters, as well as the birth mothers of sons. Very romantic sort of honeymoon feelings. Then, and that lasts for a fairly short time, a few weeks, a few months, maybe during the first year, but usually a few weeks to a few months. And then we found the phase that we called the minefield phase. And that lasted, averaged 3 to 5 years. And that is where you're sort of wandering along in your reunion. Everything seems to be going just fine. Your kids meet the newfound brother or sister. Your mother actually didn't disown you when she found out that you're having a reunion. And then there's this sort of terrible feeling that this is not going to work out because something has happened. And what we found were some things that happened to some of these minefields, as we call them, were if the birth mother is feeling, for these mothers, if their feelings about the birth father were such that they were still horrified by the man and devastated by what had happened to them back then, that could affect how they actually felt about the son or the daughter. So the birth father is in the picture here in terms of a possible minefield for birth mothers, that they will have to think about this guy and deal somehow once again with this person in their lives. He does come up. Some of them come up in positive ways, so it doesn't always have to be a minefield, but this was a potential minefield for many of them. Another one was the other siblings in the family. Some of the siblings were very positive and warm and welcoming. Others were very distancing, very upset, and understandably very jealous, some of them, to find out that there was this, for them, new baby in the family. And especially because, as most of the birth mothers I speak with and for myself, you really do think a lot of your time is spent thinking about this new child and trying to build a relationship, and your other people in your life sort of get second place here. And so that does cause some of the siblings to be very hurt and very angry and very jealous. I think we need to do a lot more with helping siblings understand about adoption and what it's like for an adoptee to have to come back as a stranger into the family. and how difficult that is, but while at the same time, you know, understanding that the siblings didn't cause this either, and that they have feelings about this that are understandable. But I think we need to do a lot more work with siblings, because that can be a real issue for some of the birth mothers. In only one of our situations with the birth mothers we spoke with, did the siblings' strong negative reaction to the new kid and not end the relationship, but made it extremely difficult. There was really only one where it made it extremely difficult for the mother and the new son to get together. So siblings. Now husbands are another potential minefield for birth mothers when they come back. And this can be both for birth fathers who have married the mothers, as well as for husbands who weren't the fathers of these children, and who were told about this. Some of the fathers knew about this, some didn't. But this is a problem for the husbands of the wives, whether they are the birth father of the child or not, and whether they were told in the beginning about the child or not. It made it harder when the guy wasn't told. That made it much harder for the birth mothers when the child came back, that they hadn't told their husband. But what seemed to be mostly the problem for the birth fathers was the time, again, the time that the birth mother was spending on this new relationship. It's all she talked about, it's all she wanted to talk about. Some of the husbands felt very abandoned and very ignored by the birth mother. And in a couple of cases, it did threaten the marriage seriously. An issue came up, for instance, with one of the birth mothers, that when she reconnected with the birth father, in terms of, again, helping the daughter who came back meet him, they began almost to parent this new found daughter together, and really became like a ghost family. The ex-boyfriend, in other words, the birth mother and the newfound child. The marriage did not end, but it threatened that marriage for many months and was a serious issue. So the husband's reactions and how one deals with that can be a minefield. Another minefield are the parents of the birth mothers way back when, during the pregnancy and the surrender and the relinquishment, because many parents back then, because it was the thing to do, really encouraged, and in some cases definitely pushed their daughters into relinquishing their children. And over the years, those parents had either had regrets about that and had expressed that to their daughter when the reunion happened. So sorry we had to do that. I want to meet so-and-so, please bring him over. That could happen. But what could also happen is that the grandparents then, who are now grandparents, stood by their original decision. We did the best we could. I would do it again. It wasn't my fault. You got pregnant. It was your problem. And with the newfound son or daughter, some refused to meet them. So that became another major issue for the birth mothers. The birth mothers in our sample and the birth mothers who I tend to talk with in our support group, at this time in their lives, almost unanimously made the decision that if that was the response of the grandparents, they would call them and say, I'm really sorry you feel this way. I wish you didn't feel this way, but I'm going to have a relationship with this child, and until you can be a little more accepting about that, I can't see you. So this time around, some of the birth mothers, another minefield is to be, some of them were forced into making another choice between two people in their lives. So that can be a minefield. Now the one thing that reunion does, the one absolute thing it does, is reconnect the mothers and the children. That's the one thing it does. I know there are birth mothers out there who did not want to be reconnected in that way, or who seem to not want to be, or having a lot of trouble with that and rejecting the notion of being reconnected. But again, the ones we spoke with, the reconnection was not a problem. That was joy, that was relief, that was a lot of positive feelings. When one listens to birth mothers talk, and in our interviews this was true, the problems definitely begin in post-reunion. Every birth mother we talked to said that whatever problems this had brought into her life, that she would have done this again, every one of them. By the same token, they also complained and had a lot of concerns about what to do with this newfound child, so that the reunion can be very happy and joyous, but again, the post-reunion can be very, very difficult. Now, the third phase that we found was that there is a calm period that for most of these birth mothers did come. Usually, as I said, after about 3, 4, or 5 years, the relationship settled out into some kind of calmness, sort of a mutual acceptance, getting through a lot of the ups and downs and the fights. And the first fight, which was very important to a lot of us, the first time a birth mother can get angry at her son or daughter or criticize her son or daughter, was a major step. And a lot of the birth mothers we spoke with said that that was crucial in their post-reunion, that until they could do that, and it took some of them years to be able to do that, that they almost couldn't feel intimate with their son or daughter, because they were stuffing a lot of their own criticism about the child or the child's behavior, whatever else, down. So that there is a period of calm, but there is still, for some of the birth mothers, as I said, even 9 years into the reunion or 10 years into the reunion, something might happen on the adoptee side of the reunion that would make the adoptee begin to pull away. And that caused some of those birth mothers a great deal of pain. That relationship, even that late in the day, and after all of those years of getting through some very difficult adjustments, still wasn't going to work out. Now, one thing that I know that we did ask about in our interviews, and that is being experienced by some birth mothers, and they're reporting this in groups, is something called what we're calling, I guess, for lack of a better phrase at this point, genetic sexual attraction. And we did ask the women in our group about this, and had they experienced this, and how would they describe it, and what had this meant to their post-reunion relationship. And several of the birth mothers in our sample had experienced this with their sons, and again described it, as I said earlier, as a dating relationship. It did cause them some upset. They did feel uneasy about this. In one instance, the mother and the son talked about it and said, "This feels like I'm dating you. I'm meeting you at a restaurant. I got all dressed up in my best clothes." And he said, "Yep, it kind of feels like that to me too." Now, this particular couple they talked about it a little bit, and it didn't seem to ruin the relationship. And as I said earlier, I think it's important to know that one of the mothers, at least in our sample, talked about falling in love with her daughter. She said, it was just like falling in love. I lost weight, I wanted to look better. I had my hair done a different style. I wanted to be at my best for my daughter. What generally the mothers described when we asked them about genetic sexual attraction, tell us a little about that, and so forth, was that they felt that it was like with a newborn baby, wanting to touch it and look at it and goo at it and sort of get very mushy about it, and just overwhelming feelings of love and affection and tenderness. And that seemed, from the sample again we spoke with, that seemed more like what that was about. But there was definitely sort of a sexual component to that, because the sons were now in their 20s, the birth mothers were middle-aged, or the mothers, were looking at their sons not just as babies. So that I think probably there is something out there for some of the mothers who meet some of the sons where that can become a problem. And my understanding is, in talking to some group leaders, it has indeed become a problem and interfered with the relationship in some serious ways. We didn't see it carried to that extent, but I certainly think there is something that has to do with rebonding as they begin to attach anew. And by the way, about bonding, again, my sense of bonding is that bonding is what happens prenatally between a mother and an infant she's carrying. The bonding has to do with pregnancy, the 9 months, almost a year of pregnancy, when the bonding is a mutual bond, and that attachment is what happens after a baby is born and begins to attach to the family it was born into, or begins to attach to the adoptive family. But I think those are, in some ways, some different experiences for the children and for the mothers, which is why we call the book Birth Bond, because I really do feel, listening to the mothers talk, that the bond is there. It is not broken by law. It is not broken by keeping a secret. It is not even broken if the relationship does not work out and the people just simply don't like each other. That is a bond that occurs at that time in one's life and lasts until we die. So that's what I have to say about bonding and attachment. Now, another minefield that's important to talk about, that the mothers talked about, was the adoptive family. That, adoptive families, many of them perhaps, are very, very frightened of more in a way of a post-reunion relationship than even of a search and a reunion, because I think a lot of adoptive parents, or at least some adoptive parents, would begin to adjust to and feel comfortable with the idea of their adult son or daughter, at least, meeting the birth family and meeting the birth mother. But what we found was that for some adoptive parents, when the son or daughter said, there's going to be more, there's going to be an ongoing relationship here, the adoptive family that was so supportive up till that point withdrew and really forced or tried to force their son or daughter into making a choice between the two families. So that can be another minefield. The adoptive family's attitude about and whether they help their son or daughter search can help make a post-reunion run a little more smoothly, a little bit better for the adoptee and the birth mother, and the ones who make it hard make the post-reunion harder. So they're another element in this that's very important. And I think that I just wish there were a way that we could reach more adoptive families, because every session I've been in here today, I keep hearing this fear on the part of the adoptive family. Fear and some defensiveness, I think, that they are having troubles to deal with. So maybe if we can begin to reach out to them in different ways than we've been able to so far, will help with this post-reunion as far as they go. The other thing we found about this sample in terms of this whole issue of will I lose my son or daughter if I'm an adoptive parent to the birth family, we had, as I said, we interviewed 30 birth mothers. Of the children of those birth mothers, now adult, 25 or 6 of the sons and daughters basically decided to go between the two families in terms of where they placed themselves post-reunion. This is the adoptee now. 25 or 26 placed themselves in both families. They became blended families. The adoptee, for instance, would travel for some of the vacations and holidays to the birth family and some to the adoptive family. In some cases, the birth mothers and the adoptive mothers became very, very good friends, and when they lived close enough, would join some of the same swim clubs and exercise clubs and have lunch and dinner together. So most of the adoptees sort of just placed themselves in both families. 2 adoptees in the group placed themselves during post-reunion at some point, mostly in the birth family. And in both instances, that had to do with the fact that for those 2 adopted persons, their adoptive families had been abusive for many years, as regular families can be too, and having found the birth families and siblings and so forth, where things were better for them in terms of healthier relationships and so forth, they did place themselves in the birth family. Neither of those adoptees totally abandoned the adoptive family, but their contact with their adoptive families during our interviews were very, very minimal. And one or two of the adoptees placed themselves more firmly in the adoptive family in terms of time spent, feelings, how they felt about people, and so forth. But as I say, the vast majority of this small sample definitely blended the families together and were able to do that. Now, we also talked a little bit about, with the birth families, this whole issue of how happy is this for you? How pleasurable is this for you? How painful? You're trying to get a sense of, on balance, was this mostly a positive, pleasurable, happy thing, this post-reunion experience, or was it mostly very painful, very difficult thing, or was it something else? And what we found was that, again, mostly, in a case of 5 out of the sample, mostly they said it was pleasure from the beginning, and it stayed pleasurable, and it stayed happy, and everyone was basically thrilled, and whatever problems were there were absolutely non-existent, really, because they didn't see them as problems. Now, in another 4 or 5, mostly they said the post-reunion had been painful, that the problems were of such an extent and of such duration during the years that mostly it was painful, but they weren't going to end the relationship, and they didn't, but that they described as being mostly painful. Again, in the largest group, which you might expect, they described it as mixture, pain and pleasure, that there were serious problems but that again, those problems did not interfere in such a way that it would be mostly pain. But the vast majority said it was an exquisite mixture of pain and joy. And a lot of that actually we felt had, and this is an interpretation, but we sort of felt that a lot of the pleasure pain description from birth mothers has to do with the sort of glass half full, half empty on that last group. That's where personality came in. That sort of, given you're kind of in the middle, if your personality is such that tends to say, but mostly, I feel my glass is half full. That's what they said, and the others said mostly my glass is half empty. So personalities do play into this in other ways too, but certainly in that. We asked them a little bit about what were the most difficult, what were the worst things about post-reunion. And the first and most important response that the birth mothers gave was that the worst thing and the most difficult thing was that they couldn't undo the past, that they couldn't undo the loss, that post-reunion, that reunion and that post-reunion and that 10 years into a relationship doesn't take away the X number of years that you have not had that child in your life, that you can't undo it. And I think a lot of birth mothers who got into reunions and post-reunions, I think some of us hoped and tried to undo that. I know I'm still trying to undo it because it's so painful to accept what you can't ever have when it's this important. It's when it's a child, So that was the first thing, that they couldn't raise their child was the first thing. The second thing they found most difficult, and I think a lot of women will immediately understand this one, is struggling to serve everyone's needs and everyone's best interest. Again, that whole issue of who do I think of first today? Do I think of my daughter who's had to come back and it's so hard for her and I want to help her feel good? My husband who's complaining about how come all I ever want to talk about now is my daughter? My other kids who are saying, well, yeah, it's nice that she's back, but what does she want? So to try to deal with everybody's needs became the second most difficult thing for the mothers to struggle with. Then the third most difficult difficult thing about post-reunion was the adoptive parents, when the adoptee would not tell the adoptive parents that they were seeing the birth mother. And some of the adoptees, in terms of going back and forth between the two families, almost did it as though they were now having an affair with the birth family. They didn't tell their adoptive family they were doing this when the adoptive family was so disapproving, but they wanted to do it for themselves. So again, there was another secret almost was being placed into the post-reunion, a different kind of secret, but a secret. The birth mothers felt, I think, very much in those cases, just like they had when they were perhaps teenagers or in their 20s or whatever and had the children, that they were so bad and so despicable that they should not be mentioned, and that of course a child should have to sneak around to see them and couldn't do it out in the open because it was like a dirty little secret again. They became the dirty little secret. That was difficult for a lot of the mothers to handle. Now, the fourth most difficult thing about post-reunion tended to be the birth father issues. When the birth father didn't welcome the child, that became a problem for the birth mother and stirred up all kinds of old unresolved issues around him. Reliving the past with him, even when it was positive, as in the case of one of the birth mothers I just mentioned, became very difficult, as you can imagine, in her life. So the birth father, again, and the adoptive parents loom very large in post-reunion. Post-reunion doesn't happen on a blank slate. They're all these figures, and even if they're just ghost figures, they are there and they are powerful and they influence these relationships. And about the fifth thing down is telling the birth mother's other children, her having to tell her other children, and I've heard that today in some other sessions, again, was a very difficult, and for some of them they described it as the worst thing about post-reunion and couldn't believe that when they told their children, almost without exception, the kids basically said, I'm sorry you had to go through that. That must have been awful. What else don't I know about you? Yeah, are there any more out there? My sons, for instance, said to me that Well, they were among the ones who said, I'm really sorry that you had to go through this and Dad had to go through this. And now, Mom, I know why the third word we learned after Mommy and Daddy was condom. Because I was one of those, because I was one of those birth mothers who, having had 2 sons after this pregnancy of my own when I was in college, and with their friends who still talk about this, and now all of their friends who they went through high school with know about Karen and have met Karen, but they were always completely appalled when at age like 13 or 14, they'd be going off to a party, and I would say, listen, in high school, I think that's too young to be having sex, you know, blah, 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 it's emotional, blah, 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 but if you do, you must use condoms. Do you all know what that is and where to get them? And I have talked to other birth mothers who were as absolutely crazy as I was about that issue. It became a big issue in my life that no one else, no other woman, should ever have to go through a pregnancy like that, unless she chose to and wanted and could keep the baby. I mean, my kids have done a lot of things, some good, some bad in their lives, but neither of them would dare come home and tell me that they weren't going to raise their own child if they hadn't chosen an abortion first. So anyway, telling the other children can be a real problem for the birth mothers, but it needn't be, and so those of us who've done it can share that with those women, that by and large the kids have really been great, I think. Then a very difficult thing, as I've sort of alluded to, is the birth mothers trying to come to terms with a real person in their adopted away son or daughter, a real person, a real large, not baby, not infant person in their lives. And dealing with their own mixed feelings about that, having to give up fantasies. One of the fantasies that a lot of birth mothers have had to give up, or some numbers of them, is that their child had what I would call a good enough family, because I'm not a believer in perfect human beings or perfect families or perfect anything, but I think what at least some of us had certainly been guaranteed and certainly hoped for and worried about was that the child would have a good enough family. Nobody gets perfect, but a lot of us had to come up against the fact and give up that fantasy, because we had to come up against the fact that our kids had been brought up in abusive adoptive families. And there are a lot of birth mothers out there who have a lot of trouble saying that in public, because we are concerned about being hurtful to adoptive families. And we don't want to imply that all adoptive families are abusive. They're not. Neither are all families one grows up in abusive, but they are out there. And they are out there more often, I think, than any of us expected. So that, again, I think we need to address some of these harsh issues and try to do this better so this doesn't happen to other children and other families. Then there were some of the other less worse, but still very difficult things. Some milder marital disturbances, but that they worked things out. And actually, some of the marriages got stronger I think that's important to say too, that some of the marriages, even between the birth fathers and birth mothers, got stronger during the post-reunion. And I think it was because people finally could talk about this issue, this secret that they couldn't talk about before. And if they could tolerate the pain. And I think that post-reunion requires, and I think even searching and reunion and post-reunion, all of that requires sort of getting to a point in one's life where we're willing to let the pain in and to acknowledge the pain and to begin to deal with it. I think until we're ready for that, you can't do a search, you can't have a reunion, and you can't have a post-reunion. That's, to me at least, one very important issue around adoption. And there's so much pain for so many of us that it's awfully hard to get to that point. But I think if we get there, we can sort of move on. And then telling acquaintances was another difficult thing that birth mothers mentioned, having to tell their friends and perhaps the people they worked with. And everyone had a way of doing that. Some people told just their closest friends, but nobody at work. Some people told everyone. Some people waited for a couple of years and then went on TV and talked about it. So not only did their closest friends and the people at work know about it, but millions of people in the United States. And I got to that point. I really enjoyed that. But the bottom line with post-reunion of the people who we spoke with, who, as I mentioned earlier, it's a bias sample, these were mothers who felt that whatever came along, some profound good came out of this reunion and this post-reunion. And that is what they told us in the end, that whatever the confusion was, whatever the pain, and there was a lot of it for all of us in these post-reunion periods, profound good came out of it. And I'd like to open it up just for discussion and questions and comments. Yeah?
Yes, Linda, the group that you surveyed, were they all birth mothers who searched themselves, or was it a combination of searching and of being found?
It was both, and in fact that's a good question, because when Judy and I started this project, we thought we were going to divide into categories: found birth mothers who searched, and perhaps birth mothers who were matched. You know, and we found that you can't really do that, because there were a lot of birth mothers who, when we interviewed them, although they had been found, they had wanted to be found. They had wanted to be found, and they had taken some steps along those years of being found, sending letters back to the agency. Some of them had fantasies and even hired private detectives to find out where the child lived so they could go and look at the child but not reach out. In other words, there really isn't, there was too much muddiness. We really had to say that, and again, for those who searched, again, they were sometimes found at about the same time their son or daughter was searching for them. So I think this whole question of found and searched is a little muddier than sometimes we think of it as. It's not that clean. Birth mothers I interviewed, I said, now, you were found. And she said, well, but I was searching too, and told about a few things she had done. And so I think it's important to know that it's not always pure and clean. Yeah, right. Anything else? Yes, okay.
5 years ago, and we talked about
Stand up so people can hear you if you
talked
yeah.
about the walking on eggs phase. Was when we first met. There was just such a not wanting to say anything that was going to be, taken in the wrong way. We weren't used to each other, and it really was. It was long with the honeymoon phase. It was there. You just kind of did everything so perfectly, and then finally you couldn't deal with that any longer. So then you explain things.
Yes, yes. I think that issue of walking on eggs and handling each other with kid gloves is very important. And I think, again, it has something to do with why people, I think, sometimes don't search or don't want to, once they're found, meet their son or daughter or their mother or father, because there's information that a lot of adoptees have about their own lives, their own selves, that they may feel uncomfortable sharing with the birth mother, fearing that the birth mother won't like that part of themselves, won't like it that, a son that you find is gay, or a daughter is a lesbian, or the daughter has been divorced 3 times, or the adoptive family abused them. And there are birth mothers, I think, who sometimes are afraid of the connection with the child because they're not so happy, or they feel some shame, whether they should or not, about issues in their own lives. And that prevents us from doing that. And we walk on eggs for a long time before we can admit things about each other. So that is an issue. Yes, Ray?
Did you find many birth mothers reluctant to share information about the birth fathers with their children?
No. In fact, we were very surprised about what we found out about the birth fathers. No, even there was one mother in our sample who had been raped, and that was how she happened to get pregnant and have this child. And when the child came back as a young adult, this woman not only welcomed her, but thanked her, because for the first time in those 20-odd years, the birth mother now could deal with not just the relinquishment and adoption, but the rape. And not only that, but these mothers were more than willing to give the fathers names, even when they didn't like the guy. The mothers we spoke with said, I don't like that guy, he rode a motorcycle, he was like this, he was like that, but you have a right to know his name, and I will give it to you. And the birth fathers in this group again, we were very surprised that these were men, oftentimes, who had a lot of feelings about these children, who had worried about them, who looked forward to meeting them, and who were at least willing to meet them once and share information. And some of them got quite close in terms of the families. The birth fathers had to deal with some of the same issues. Had they told their wives, the women they had married, about this child? Some of them were very concerned about that. But the birth mothers were very forthcoming about the birth fathers, even when it was very hard and very painful for the birth mother. Yes?
Linda, you had said that there was only one school
Sandy.
who could not integrate
Yeah.
the birth family. I was kind of surprised that it was so high that most of them were able to blend. But for those few that aren't, is it more? Have you found that it has more to do with they just dislike the person, or it has to do with the loyalty problem?
Sandy, it's sort of hard to know that, and we didn't really go into looking at that particular question. It appeared from the couple of instances, you're talking about where the adoptee placed themselves more firmly in the adoptive family. It appeared as though the personality issues between the adoptees and their birth mothers were difficult. But none of these people ended these relationships. They were in each other's lives, even if it was a matter of a few cards a year or a visit once every few years, even in those situations. So I don't know really what the balance is there. Yes, Helen. Yeah.
Did you have anything in your sample or your questionnaire as to regard to what the adoptive parents, as to what their reaction would be or how they would feel about meeting the adoptive parents?
In this sample, of course, now remember, we interviewed the birth mothers, so when we asked the birth mothers about the birth fathers or about the adoptees or the adoptive family, it was coming through the birth mothers. This was her view of it. But I would say again, in this sample, and I think this is where you see the bias perhaps, because these are women who came forward for whom the reunion had gone reasonably well, which assumes that somehow the adoptive families here had not at least been so powerful in preventing their kids from having the post-reunion. So that we made the assumption, and I think it was probably pretty accurate, that the adoptive families of these birth families were pretty supportive about the search originally that their kids had done, or about the contact the birth mothers had made with their families. But there was a range of, again, of the nature of the relationship between the birth families or the adoptee and the other family. I mean, there were cool adoptive family relationships with the birth family, and there were very, very close ones at the same time. But I think in this sample, what we saw with the birth mothers is pretty true in a sense of the adoptees and the adoptive families. These were all people who'd been separated through adoption, who were willing to come back together and not just meet once, but decide to have an ongoing relationship. And I suspect there are many factors in there to do with personalities and temperament and geography and so forth. Although geography didn't really play a big factor here in terms of the nature of the ongoing relationship, because we had kids, adoptees, who lived on the other side of the country from the birth families, and although they didn't see them, therefore, a whole lot, the quality of their description of their feelings about each other was positive. Yeah.
In what percentage of the families, you were saying that one of the problems was that some of the relationships were secretive of the child with the birth mother, secretive, held secret from the adoptive family. How did that go? What were those fractions like? And in the situations where the adoptive parents knew about the birth parent and the contact, were there problems, or did it generally go pretty well?
Again, we didn't interview adoptees about what happened between them and their adoptive families around this. What we know, again, is the report of the birth mothers, what the adopted person had told the birth mother about the adoptive family. The secretiveness was in two or three instances, where the adoptee very much wanted to continue a relationship with their birth family, but didn't want the adoptive family to know. Now, again, the reporting of the adoptee to the birth mother to us was usually, in those three instances, that the adoptive family, they were afraid of hurting their adoptive mother, particularly the adoptive mother. They were just afraid of hurting her. The adoptive families had all known about the search, and they had all known about the reunion. So in these 2 or 3 instances, what the adopted person was keeping secret was the ongoing post-reunion part of it. And one of them did say, which suggests maybe one part of this, that the adoptive mother had said to her, when the daughter said, and I want to keep seeing so-and-so, she said, well, why on earth would you want to do that? I thought you just wanted to meet, get the information, get your medical history, see someone who looked like you. What on earth would you have in common with those people? So that may have, so for that adoptee, I guess that sounded like the mother would disapprove and the adoptee didn't want to hurt her feelings. Yes?
I wonder if the birth mothers spoke to you at all about her extended family and their reaction to the placement or the adoption, if the extended family was aware of the placement to begin with, how they reacted, how they were able to explain their participation in this adoption, the guilt aspect, how they could overcome that, and that kind of thing. Did anything like that come up in your survey?
Yes, it did, and I'll start off by answering that question with my story about my mother. When Karen, our daughter, came back, my mother was the only living grandparent, unfortunately, by that time. And my mother was and is a very private, quiet person in general. And, but nevertheless, when Karen came back, I called her right up and said, hi, Mom, you know, it's me, and I have some incredible news. Remember that child? Why, yes, of course I do, she said to me. She was in her early 70s then. And I said, well, she's found us. And I had never told my mother about the letter I had written. As I said, it was never discussed. So I told my mom about the letter I had written, how Karen had found us. And my mother, I thought, was incredibly empathic. She did very well in this way, because she said to me that if she had given a child away, she would want to know what had happened. And again, this is someone who's not usually that forthcoming with how she feels about things or would feel. She also said if she were an adopted person, she would want to know who her birth family was. Well, we didn't know the terms birth family, but her heritage and her background and her history and so forth. And then she said to me, and I think it's wonderful for you and your, Walter, my husband, and the boys, and I'm very happy for you. I hope it goes well, but I don't think I can meet her. I just don't think I can meet her, because your father and I did the best we could back then, and I don't want to be questioned about that. I don't want to be, asked about that, and I don't want to be criticized for that. So I said, fine, you don't have to meet her. Everybody has a right to make their own decisions. But she said, but I would like to know how it goes. So we sort of, for 2 or 3 years, my mother would ask me, how's it going, how's it going? I was very interested, gave me a very clear message that I could talk about Karen with her, that she was interested in this. The thing that bothered my mother most, and it took her, and she just wouldn't believe it, was the issue that the adoptive family had not been what we had hoped it would be. And my mother couldn't believe it, because she shared my fantasy, which is so unfair to adopting people, but that they are perfect and they were going to be wonderful. And she just couldn't believe that an agency person would give a child to someone who wasn't that perfect and that wonderful. That was the hardest piece for her, I think. 3 years after Karen came back, my mom called me up and said, could you bring Karen over to meet me? And I said, sure, great. And she said, now, of course, there'll be a couple of things here. If anybody visits the house while Karen is here, I'm going to tell her, this is what I'm going to tell her. And my mom made up the most complicated story. She said, I said, listen, I'll give you a simpler story if you need a story. She said she would tell the neighbors or anyone who came in that Karen was the daughter of my sister's college roommate. That's how far away my mother put Karen. And she also said, and you would need to tell Karen that she couldn't ask me any questions about the past, because, So I told Karen that and said, listen, Karen, I don't care if you meet my mom. I mean, I love my mom loves me, but you don't have to meet her if those conditions aren't suitable to you. If they make you feel less of a person, don't meet her. It's not that important. But Karen, of course, wanted very much to meet her grandmother. So we went over, we drove over. My mom lives about 4 hours away. We drove over. We walked up the front steps, and my mom came out, and she put her arms around Karen, put her hands on her face, and said, I'm so glad you're here. come right in. And if you have any questions, I will answer anything. And, and proceeded during that evening to tell Karen things I hadn't even told her, which was fine, about I married the birth father, so my mother had a lot to say about his family's non-participation in this whole, and so forth. So I often tell the story because I think some of us say how we're going to do or what we're going to feel is sometimes different than what we feel ultimately or when we're confronted with certain situations. So
That eventually turned out fine.
yes.
Do you have any others that you could report on that
Yes.
the extended family was not particularly?
Yes. With one of the birth mothers, the one that comes to mind immediately is a birth mother who was, I think, 16 or 17 when she relinquished this child. And she had one younger brother, and her parents really were forcing her to give this child up because she tried for, I think, 7 months. This probably is in the book. For 7 months to keep this child. She had gone to a Salvation Army home. Once she got pregnant enough, until that time, she was kept in her bedroom at home and not allowed to go out, even though her pregnancy was during the hot summer months. And she would take walks at night to get cool, and so forth. But the parents were very involved and did not want her to keep this baby, even though she did and could have probably raised this child. And she searched for her son. When she found her son, again, the only living relative, grandparent, was the mother. And the mother, when we interviewed this birth mother, the grandmother had not met this kid, was very angry that the birth mother was seeing him, and as far as I know, when I saw the birth mother a couple of years ago, had still not met the child, the adult, her grandson. And this birth mother was particularly upset about this because it turned out that her son, the grandson, looked exactly like her father and herself, and was very much like her father and herself. So that was a case where the grandmother couldn't or wouldn't come to grips with this reunion. It caused a lot of pain for the mother. And this was there's some other things too that I might mention, because this was one of the mothers who never had other children. And there were 7 or 8 of them in our sample who never had another child. Again, contrary to what social workers often see birth mothers like, oh, you'll have 1 million kids. I don't know what they think we are, but anyway, well, yes, I do know what they think we are. But this was her only son, and it was the only grandchild in the family. So, of course, my feeling is there was a lot of loss there, and then everything in between. Some reluctance, some coming around, and then some real rejection like that. Yeah.
I know you didn't ask for this, but I would like to give a plug for this book. And when you're reading, be sure to pick this book up over there. I find it a very refreshing book. And I'm rather biased because my mother appeared in the book as Faye. I don't believe she was one of the 30, but she was one of the 36.
Okay.
And I did count up how many times you were quoted. It was 15.
Oh, I'm so glad. Oh, I'm so glad you're here, and thank you for saying that. And of course, I'd love to say, oh, gee whiz, I'm so modest, but I love it. Thanks a lot for saying that. The other thing is that raises another point, that the issue of naming of the birth mothers who wanted to be named in the book. A lot of them wanted their full names, their addresses, their phone numbers right in that book. And I'm one of those people who feels that way. But because it was a research project, we just felt we couldn't do it, even though it was on a topic that in my heart, I wanted everybody who wanted their names there, right there. But it was not something we could do because of the nature of it. Wasn't a novel, it wasn't just a little short thing, and we were concerned about the researchy implications.
You called me Faye's daughter, and that was fine.
That is great. I'm so glad you're here. Yeah.
Something about birth mothers projecting their feelings about the birth father onto the child. I'm just wondering, is there anything, any idea about how adoptees can try to help their birth mothers cut back on that kind of association, to deal with them as their own individual?
What a good question. There are probably other people in the room who can try to deal with that one also, or help respond to that. I don't know. I think that I think that women who relinquish their children to adoption have gotten a real bad rap in this culture for a very long time. I think the fathers who abandoned the girlfriends or the woman they got pregnant and their children have gotten probably even a worse rap. And it's very hard, I think, for a lot of the mothers to give any goodness to those men because of the pain that they suffered, in part because of the guys who didn't marry them. But I don't know how to deal with a particular individual mother about that. I think that what would help the mothers is to hear birth fathers speaking up, and that's a book that somebody needs to do, is interview birth fathers, because when we did ask these women about the birth fathers, and then when we interviewed some birth fathers, these were not all the cads and bad guys that I know I thought most of them were. These were guys who were also young and confused and frightened, and just as much, some of them, under their parents' thumbs as the women who were actually, and these were young men who were actually told by some of the social workers at some of the agencies back then, look, just sign on the dotted line and you don't have to have anything to do with this kid. You can go back to school, you can go on with your life. I mean, even more so, I think some of the young men were let off the hook in that way than the young women. So that the only way I can think of really addressing that is to get more birth fathers to come out and talk about this so that the women can understand them.
I'm wondering whether that would affect a specific individual birth mother in a case where she's projecting some feelings about a specific individual birth mother who isn't speaking out.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of things, well, yeah, Ken, do you want to help me out here?
No, I was trying to build on that. I've got another question.
No, you go ahead, because I really, that's not an area where I'm equipped to
My
answer.
question was that in at least 2 instances that I've been involved in, and that's a small sample, but I will generalize from sample 1. In these 2 instances, the birth mother, after the reunion, then reactivated her relationship with the birth father to untangle and work on that relationship. And I'm wondering if that's common or whether that's rather atypical or whether you have any thoughts on it.
Well, some of the birth fathers, yes, in our sample, the birth mothers and the birth fathers did do that. They did come together. They did at least have one conversation about what had happened. It usually occurred in the context of the mother calling the father when she knew where he was, and a number of them did know where these guys were. And they would talk out for the first time again what happened, and often the men apologized for their piece of it, because we all have a piece of that. There's responsibility across the board here. And when the birth fathers were forthcoming, which I think is sort of Bob's issue too, when the birth fathers could say, I made a mistake too. Or, if you had told me, I might have been able to have helped you out. In one case in the book, there was only one of the mothers we interviewed who never told her parents she was pregnant, never told the father that he was a father. When the son came back and found her, she was also a mother who had never had any other children and had never married. When the son came back and found her, she called the birth father and her parents and told them for the first time. And that birth father was very willing to meet that son. So even under, I think all of this points to this whole issue of encouraging people to have direct contact with each other, and any of us who've had our own experiences with this, or any of the mental health professionals, just have to say, this is my experience, or this is what I think, but there's no way to know how somebody's going to feel unless you go to them and you ask them directly. There's no other way. No one can say, well, I think he'd say this, or I think she'd say that. So. Mm-hmm.
Years later, having to deal with that broken relationship and mending that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, what happened in my situation was that when my eldest sister found me, and I had this reunion with 4 other siblings, plus my birth father. And of course, this was 16 years ago, and I was only 18. But throughout the past years, we have come together in understanding that at first my father was very fearful of me because I kept wanting to know about my deceased mother and I kept asking questions, you know, and then it got on to the open records issue and he was very upset about that. And then we didn't speak for 5 years. There was a period of dead silence. And while I had ongoing relationships with my siblings. And then one day I just decided, well, this is crazy. We are related, and I'm going to have a relationship with my father, whether he likes it or not. I showed up on his doorstep again after 5 years, and he welcomed me. We have a very good relationship now. And what I found the second time around was he started bringing up my mother. Every time he saw me, he would say, well, your mother did this, your mother did that. And then finally it got too much for me, and I said, look, Dad, you don't have to do that. I want to know you.
Yes.
You know, it's not that, you know, there's this deceased person that it's in the way of our relationship. So now we've bridged that gap, and in a way he confronted his deceased wife by virtue of discussing it with me, and you know, maybe that helped a lot. And I don't know whether this is any bearing on your project, but you know, I'm just kind of tossing it out.
Well, I think it definitely has bearing because it's a situation of separation from your original family and how men as well as women handle that. And I think, too, you point out the important thing that people don't remain fixed over a lifetime, that people change, situations change, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, but nothing ever stays exactly the same, and to keep trying some of these.
As a mother that was reunited with her son just 7 years ago, I had some things to work through at the point of the reunion as far as the birth father was concerned. I went back and I think I would say there's too many birth mothers who are struggling with this issue right now. Do I want my son to meet his birth father or my daughter to meet her birth father? When I placed my son for adoption, I truly did what I thought was best for him. So then, to work it through with that in mind again, what's in his best interest? He was interested in meeting him. So to make a call, I had to do it through a third party because I wasn't sure exactly where he was, nor was I sure whether his wife, or if, you know, I don't know if he married once, twice, or 3 times. At that stage, we hadn't kept contact through the years. So there were a lot of unknowns, and it was scary, but I went through a mutual friend, school friend, who contacted him and made sure that his wife was aware that he had a child, that a child would be placed for adoption, and this was in the woodwork. And would he be interested in talking with me about my newfound son and the relationship we have, and the son would like to meet him. So we did talk, and for me, I found it very therapeutic, that release, the release in letting go of any remaining hostility toward him, the rejection, letting all of that go, and it is a process, and sometimes it can come back. But what I found helpful as well is writing a lot of things out, writing to him in a very unthreatening way, and in a way that if his wife could read it together with him, and as a family they could share later if they wanted to explain the reunion to their children, which they happen to have 2 adopted children. So,
Interesting.
I think if we put that child ahead, continually put the child ahead of our interests, since that's what we started out to do.
Yes.
So I went right through the pregnancy in writing what I went through, because we didn't keep in contact a lot. I told him about how I felt, but at the same time I did it in a way that wasn't going to, that shouldn't have added any more guilt, I don't think. And sent pictures and things, and told about the reunion with my son, and opened it up very easily for him to meet. In fact, we did, and we've had both our families, his adopted family, we've all had times of dinner together, our son's wedding. And for and partly with the completion of the will.
Yeah, and birth fathers, you know, are coming more out of their closets. There's no question that more are signing up for registries, more are coming to the support groups, and a couple of fathers I've met recently, birth fathers, they're the ones of that couple with their original wives, in some cases their girlfriends. It's the fathers who want to meet and are searching for the kids, and the mothers, the birth mothers, don't want to have anything to do with it. So I think we need to really rethink about birth fathers a little bit. Go ahead. I'll get you
I
some.
wanted to comment on one reason that sometimes the extended families, for this question anyway, how they react, but sometimes the birth mother is resentful. In my case, I was resentful because nobody had been there for me at the time. But 20 years later, when I find them with no help from anybody, they all want to jump in and say, oh, well, I would have never made the father. Said, of course, I believe very strongly that my son should meet his father.
Mhm.
He had any interest at all, so I put them in touch right away, knowing the risk, which would be
Yeah.
that the father would say, well, I never signed you away. Well,
Yeah.
of course not, he wasn't there.
Yeah.
How could he have signed you away?
Mhm.
But there's part of that sort of rejection. I mean, you have to look for your rejection on the birth father, and so, and then what's he gonna do to jeopardize the relationship you could have with your child, maybe at this point? And the same with the grandparents. You know, they sometimes want to exonerate themselves, and your mother didn't want to be asked.
Right.
Well, my mother wanted to write and say, oh, we never did get to see you. And the reason they never got to see you was because they made sure I gave them up.
Right, yes.
So the birth mother still risks a lot of being stepped on all over again so that they can clear their names.
Mhm. Yes, and I think that's important in terms of taking care of ourselves. Sue, you have a question?
I'm an adult adoptee and I'm also a birth mother. And when I searched for my birth mother, I was 35 years old. I found her. I asked her about my birth father, and she refused to give me very much information. She said, well, he's not a very nice man. He wasn't there for you. He wasn't there for me. And oh my God, 35 years later, she still has this bitterness. 44 years later, she still has this bitterness, you know. And as an adult adoptee, as an adult, now we're all sitting here, this whole conference, we're saying, you know, everybody's keeping all this stuff from us. They're keeping my records, keeping their records. They're not telling secrets, they're telling us lies. And as an adult, I really resented, and I think this really put threw a real stick in our relationship with my birth mom, because she would not tell me. You know, and I finally get down, he is me, he's wonderful. We're exactly alike. Why everybody doesn't want to talk to each other. But
Yeah.
when I found my daughter last year, I thought, okay, I am going to tell the story the truth if it kills me. Okay? And a lot of things that I had to tell her, it hurt me, it upset me, it brought a lot of things back. But she is also an adult. You know, and it's one thing to talk about finding my child, finding my baby, but most of us who we find or are found, we are adults, and I think that's one thing that we really have to remember. And just, you know, I resent it as an adult. If I could take my time and my trouble and my money to find you, you had better tell me who my father is.
Yes, yes. I know. See, both of those things are true. What this woman was saying about the pain that can cause the mother who had her suffering to do way back then without these fathers, but the adoptees' pain because they have a right to know their fathers as well as their mothers. It's tricky. Back there.
Well, my situation is...
We'll get to everybody. We have time.
I found my birth mother last year. I'm 35. She still holds my birth father accountable for the fact that she got pregnant, although she never told him. And she refused to give me any of that information. And it has gotten very much into what she's pulled back out of our relationship. And she said exactly the same words. You won't like him. He's not a very nice man. And I met him in January. And he's one of the most wonderful people I've ever met in my entire life. And I think that her choice, at least at this point, not to deal with those issues in her life. She was a birth mother who never married and never had any other children, and her family is now all deceased. And I think that perhaps one of the reasons she's pulled back is that I do have a relationship with my birth father. And I pursued that even though she, in our initial conversation, told me she didn't want that to happen. But I'm an adult, and that's what I told her. And I think it's unfortunate at this point that those 35-year-old relationships are what's blocking people from being able to deal with. So she's not dealing with me at all because she's not willing to deal with that whole relationship.
I think that is very sad. I think there are reasons. I think the pain of giving a child away to other people is indescribable. I don't think there are the words in any language, certainly not in the English language, that really describe what that does to at least most women. So I think if the pain is if the birth mother has to go back and remember that pain, that's a pretty harsh thing to do. But I also think that birth mothers can be as guilty as adoptive mothers, or parents maybe I should say in all fairness, in terms of a sense of a child belongs to someone. And children are not possessions. We don't possess people's souls and bodies and minds. We just try to do the best we can for them, and there's a very special relationship between any parent and any child, but it shouldn't be possession. And there is a sense sort of in some people who can't share the people in their lives with others, whether it's a birth family or an adoptive family, that's very troublesome, that whole, and I think the culture, somehow encourages a lot of adults to think in terms of possessing children, and we don't. And some of us just don't find that out till too late, maybe. Back there with, yeah.
I was interested to hear that you also married a birth father and adopted in my birth parents' situation. They got married a couple years after I was born and they're still married. And I was wondering what ramifications you found if there's anyone else in your sample, what ramifications you found that
8 out of the 30 birth mothers had married the birth father at some point after the adoption, usually within the first few years. So that's a very high percentage in our sample. The numbers seem to be, and I think the numbers in adoption and reunion are terrible. They're just terrible. There's just no way of getting any accurate numbers. I never believe anything any of us say. I try to stay away from numbers. I don't believe it. And I don't believe anyone really has them, but I know that there are some birth mothers who marry the birth fathers, and in this group I know, skewed though it is, that was the number. And actually 4 out of those married birth parents got divorced, and 4 were still married many, 20, 30 odd years later at the time of our interviews, which is kind of interesting because it reflects, at this point in our history anyway, the divorce statistics. It also suggests, however, that people who have a child in an unusual way don't get divorced because of that, and in fact come together. So that I think what we saw with the people we interviewed is that most of those couples described that the reunion and the post-reunion gave them a chance to have a stronger marriage because of what I said a little while ago, and that is for the first time they had a chance to yell and scream at each other, to try to blame each other, because it's always nice if you can try to blame someone else for all the pain you're suffering. I know I like to do that. So they had a chance to yell and shout at each other, to really talk about what they felt like back then, and then bring it up to the present. And so some of them felt it strengthened their relationship. For others of the married birth families, it caused, I think, so much pain that they were among the people who were having some problems within the marriage. Because again, it's awfully hard sometimes to live with someone where there has been that kind of pain, whatever all the reasons have been.
What about the post-reunion relationship with the adoptee?
Again, with the people we interviewed, the married couples, the birth fathers were very in touch with the kids, but not necessarily without problems, just because they were married. And when one divorced birth family situation, I can remember that the mother was very aggravated at the birth father because, of course, there are other children who'd been born after the adopted child was born. He had visitation rights and so forth, so those kids were seeing him, And he was concerned about the adoptee visiting him. So there was an issue there that they had to work out. But I think in terms of the relationship with the kid, again, the story I know best is my own, and like some other birth mothers have said here, my daughter looks exactly like her father, exactly, more than even my sons, and they all look like him. But she is the spitting image of the birth father, and like some other mothers here and some others in our book, I have to say that, you know, I'm not proud of this, but I have to say that I resented that. And there are moments still, even 6 years later, when I resent that in the sense of, that's not fair. I was the one on the delivery table. I was the one who was expelled from college. I was the one who blah, 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 you know. And why should she even look like him? And he has had an easier time with the relationship. She and I are much closer than she and her dad are, because we share a lot of similar wonderful habits, like we both like to go out to lunch a lot, we like to shop, you know, we have a lot of things that we like to do together, and our temperaments are very much alike in our personalities, so we're very close in that way. But he's had an easier time with her. He could be very even-handed, you know, and very calm and very pleasant, and I would be one day, you know, up here and one day down here and, you know, criticizing her for something or another, or she'd be criticizing me. And the only conclusion I can draw in that sense is that we are mother and daughter. And that even though we were separated for all those years, and she did not go through her adolescence with me, that maybe in a sense we went through some of that even though she was in her 20s and I was in my 40s. So, and it may be that some of the fathers, some people have suggested that they had an easier time with their fathers, and so maybe even if you're separated for all those years, there's something about all of that issue around sons and mothers and daughters and fathers that's there anyway, even though you're separated.
I was the first of 7 born to my mother, and she gave up the second one to adoption also, but she married the second father and went on to have 5 more children. When I found my sister here in Chicago, what happened eventually was there was 2 very distinct relationships. They've thrown me away, and they have a wonderful, loving relationship with her. Yet, the only one, and that goes for the mother, the father, and the other 5 siblings. And they have absolutely no use for me, or up here too. And every once in a while I contact my birth mother, and she says, what's going on? And why can't you, she said, I don't want a relationship with you. And I said, why not? She said, because you're not my husband's child. And you're too much like your father. Those are the only 2 things she's been able to say to me. She's thrown out all kinds of other junk, but that's what it is. So, I mean, I don't know what to do about this. I won't give it up.
Good.
Found your father?
Yeah. That's another story. Yeah, we did that one the last workshop. He met me once, and he has refused to tell his wife and 4 other siblings. So, I think he's
Well, maybe we can start writing more about and talking more about in the groups this issue of the mothers somehow taking out on the kids feelings they have about the fathers, which I'm sure happens, in other relationships too. But maybe we just need to talk more about it and get it more out there so that it will change a little bit.
I kind of have a dilemma. I have a son who I've known for 9 months, and he looks exactly like the birth father. And I don't have any, I have negative feelings towards the birth father, but I've come to terms with it. And from the start, I gave him all the information on the birth father that he wanted, and he has contacted him on his own. And at first he was, very happy to hear from him and agreed to meet with him. And then, since my son lives in Tucson and I live in Chicago and the birth father lives in Chicago, over the course of phone calls, he changed his mind and now hangs up on my son, does not want to see him. And I don't know whether I should make a call to him and say, at least meet him once, because
he can't relate to me. I mean, we have a good relationship, except he doesn't look anything like me, and he feels really lost. It's like, I was adopted, I always wondered who I looked like. I don't have any pictures to give him, and I really feel really bad for him. I mean, I don't care what feelings I had, I still think the birth father owes him some family background.
Yeah.
And my son told him that, and he says, I don't owe you anything. And it really breaks my heart. And I don't know what to do to help my son meet his father.
Well, you know, one of the mothers in our book said that her ex-boyfriend, the birth father, was having trouble acknowledging the son also, but that she had come to realize they're going to have to work that out in a sense together between themselves. I mean, obviously you'll encourage them because you are to perhaps keep trying to make some kind of contact, but there are no magic answers for any of our issues here. Maybe, you know, if Oprah does a show on birth fathers, you people in Chicago get some birth fathers, you know, and get them on the show, and maybe other men will begin to feel a little more comfortable with that. But in a sense, the kids and the fathers have to work out their own relationships too, just like I think when we raise kids, at some point you need to, maybe after the infancy period when the most mothers tend to be, women tend to be more involved, not all, but most. And then at some point, you really do need to sort of you need to turn your child over, I think particularly sons maybe, to the fathers and encourage the fathers to take care of them and be involved with them. So I think birth mothers, if we can do anything, we can encourage in whatever ways we have available to us, the fathers to do that and the children to keep trying. I don't know, do you have a suggestion or a thought here?
This marks the end of session number 30, tape 1. Please turn now to session 30, tape 2.